16th of January, I am told to get on a train and get off in a small village in the Massif Central, the central mountain area of France. And I find myself at 1 o'clock in the morning on an ice-cold day on a 3,000-foot elevation plateau. And a young man comes to pick me up at the railway station. I'm dead tired. I don't know where I am. Frankly, I don't care where I am either. All I wanted to do is go to bed. The next morning, I find out that I am in a small village called Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, a most unusual village. Why? Well, France is about 95% Catholic, but in Le Chambon, the population is about 95% Protestant. Many of them are fundamentalist Christians. They live by the Bible. Their pastor, André Trocmé, was a pacifist. At the time when the French surrendered to the Nazis, he addressed his congregation and said to them, now is the time to fight the enemy with the weapons of the Spirit. And they understood what he said to them. It was a conspiracy of goodness. And these farmers, who could have made a lot of money during the war by selling their agricultural products on the black market, instead they decided to help people. 5,000 villagers saved some 3,500 or even more people. Most of them were Jewish, but they helped anyone who needed it. One of my best friends became a deserter from the German army who was 19 years old, and he, as I said, was a deserter. He was not a Jew, but he was in hiding from the Nazis. A few days after my arrival in Le Chambon, my first diary ends abruptly and disappears for many, many years. I wasn't sure anymore, did I ever write this diary, or is this something that I imagined? Anyhow, I'm in Le Chambon. There was a documentary made in the 1980s by a Hollywood producer. The title of the documentary is Weapons of the Spirit, and I appear in it briefly, and there's a scene in it that I find particularly touching. There's an elderly lady who is carrying an old book in the crook of her arm, and she's shuffling towards the temple. That's what they call their church. And the film producer says, "Excuse me, madam, but why did you help these people? I don't understand that." But she says, it's the right thing to do. It says so in the book. It says here that if someone is hungry, you ask them to come to table and you share whatever you have. If someone is sick, you go to their bedside. You try to cheer them up. If someone needs a home, you open your door and you take them in. So it was a very simple thing for them to do. It says so in the good book, and they did it. My first diary disappears. As I said, it ended abruptly. As I discovered years later, it was confiscated because it contained too many names, addresses, dates, and so forth, which, had it fallen into the hands of the French police or of the Nazis, it would have been curtains for a lot of people. Anyhow, the villagers were not content just to save the people that they had there. By the way, they refer to the Jews as the people of the book. And they decided that, we could help even more people if we provide false identity papers to the ones that are here, the ones that speak French well enough. We send them out of here, and then we can bring in additional people to help. So I, together with 4 other guys, we were given false identity papers, and we were sent to a French high school. I became Pierre Fesson, born in Auch, France, kept the same birth date, and they explained to me, the reason you keep the same birth date is that if somebody suddenly said, "What's your birth date?" you don't start stammering, no, it's got to be something naturally that comes out. All you have to remember is your new name and your place of birth. Before leaving Le Chambon, let me also say, especially when I speak to young people in schools, if you haven't been in Europe, if you haven't been in a French village, you can't imagine what it's like. Back in the Middle Ages, the French learned, or the farmers learned, that with marauding bands, armies sweeping through villages and towns, pillaging, they had to live in agglomerations tightly knit, close together, houses adjoining one another, very narrow streets to slow down the marauders so that they couldn't dash through town. And what this meant was that the streets were no wider than from the edge of the stage to the first row here. And when Farmer Charles looked out his window and the lights went out across the street, he said, it's 8:15. How do you know it's 8:15? Well, the lights go out every night at 8:15. That's the time when they go to bed. And I know that within 14 seconds, the lights come on the second floor, and then it'll be 7.5 minutes until the lights go out. That's the time it takes them to get undressed, brush their teeth, say their prayers, put on their nightgown, and go to bed. Not necessarily in that order. So, everybody knew what their neighbor was doing. And yet, during this period, lights were coming on and lights were going out in rooms that before were never lit. But there wasn't a single villager who ever asked his neighbor across the street, "Oh, you're having family in your house. I see you have the lights on," and so forth. No. As I said, it was a conspiracy of goodness, and they didn't ask because if they should be caught and interrogated, they could state with full truth, "I don't know what's going on in my neighbor's house. I don't know anything about it." So it was a marvelous thing, but this is something that young people here don't understand. In this country, if you're a farmer, your next door neighbor may be a half a mile down the road. If you live in Texas, he may be 20 miles down the road. So it's important to understand this, the situation, how people live there. I arrive in this French high school. There are 4 other kids, 5 of us coming together from Le Chambon. Again, I've always wondered, there must have been somebody in that school who knew that the 5 of us were not really Frenchmen, native Frenchmen. As I discovered about 3.5 years ago, it was the principal. The principal of that school knew perfectly well that we were Jews as defined under French law, hiding under a false identity. He put his job and his life on the line. Again, someone who did the right thing, who helped my being here tonight. Move the clock forward. We're coming up to 1944. I start on the 1st of January 1944. I start my second diary. I change languages. I write it in the secret language that my school buddies wouldn't be able to read. I wrote it in German. So, not too smart, as I said. But anyhow, May of 1944, I am now 15 and a half. A SS division called Das Reich invades the town of Feigl and orders all the males between the ages of 16 and 54 to report to City Hall for hard labor, to work in a labor detachment. Okay, I'm a little smarter now than I was before. As I said, I'm almost 16. I'm not there yet, but by now I was smart enough and I came to the conclusion, I better lay low. I don't want to be seen. I'm going to disappear. Since from time to time I also served Mass in the adjoining Catholic church, adjoining to the courtyard of the school, I knew my way into the church. I climbed up into the church steeple and spent the next 24 hours up there. It gave me a lookout view onto the town square. I could see the trucks assembled there. I could see people being rounded up. The next morning, finally, the trucks moved out. At that point, I realized that the other 4 guys that had come with me from Le Chambon had disappeared. It wasn't until years later that I found out that one of them lives in New Jersey. I met him for the first time. I said, "How come you survived?" He said, "On that day, I was in the hospital having my appendix removed." That's how he managed to get away. The other 3 guys, unfortunately, wound up in Auschwitz. Again, I was very lucky, and that very same SS division was a notorious one. About 4 weeks later, 5 weeks later, they marched into a French village called Oradour-sur-Glane, where they rounded up in retaliation to the attack by some French resistance fighters. They had killed several German soldiers. They were going to mete out punishment. They rounded up 683 people, I believe, men, women, children, including babies. Most of them were machine gunned. The ones that survived were hustled into the local church. The doors were locked. The church was set on fire, and anyone who tried to escape through the windows or what was promptly shot. They killed everyone. They burned the village to the ground. That village today stands as a memorial, just the way the Nazis left it back there. So again, this could have been Feigl, the town where I went to school. I was lucky once more. At this point, a Jewish underground organization contacts me and says, look, you can't stay here anymore. You've got to get out. We're going to help you to escape. Get ready, pack a bag. On a moment's notice, you should be ready to leave. Indeed, a few days later, and this is all detailed in my diary, I'm put on a train, told where to get off. I spend the night at a Red Cross shelter in a town in the southeast of France. And the next day, I'm told to get on a train. I'm told to get off in a small village called Viry, which is near the Swiss border. There I would be met by passeurs. Nowadays you would call them coyotes. Those are people who were paid. They knew the area. They knew the comings and goings of the border patrols. And they briefed us on where to cross, when to cross, how to cross, and so forth. It's, again, detailed in my diary. And on a certain signal, I throw my bag over the barbed wire fence, climb over the first fence, get into the no man's land, run across it, climb up on the other fence, which is on the Swiss side, and there a Swiss soldier who stood immobile like a statue moves for the first time and says, "Get your behind the building here." So I am now arrested by the Swiss authorities. I am an illegal immigrant. I had crossed the border into Switzerland. And I am taken to a triage camp where they're going to decide what to do with me. In the triage camp, one of the guys there whispers to me and says, you know, they're shipping the Jews right back into France, right back into the hands of the French police or the German border guards, so be very careful. When I'm interrogated, and I got a copy of the interrogation report, when I sensed that they were getting ready to ship me back, I remember that someone had sewn into the lining of my jacket my baptismal certificate. I pulled it out. I showed it to the Swiss authority. "Ah, mais tu es un catholique. Bienvenue en Suisse." Well, you're a Catholic. Welcome to Switzerland. So, at least this time it worked. In my diary, I mentioned that I now sleep in a free country. Fortunately for me, the war, the hiding, was over about 2 weeks before the Normandy landings. My father had given me, years before, the name of a business associate of his, a Swiss business associate who lived in Bern. The authorities contacted that family. They decided to take me in. They were very kind. They put up with me for 1 year. After a year, they begged the Red Cross, please take the little bastard off our hands. We can't stand him anymore. He's impossible. He's uncontrollable. So I was now bounced from one place to another. Most places couldn't tolerate me more than 6 weeks at a time. But ultimately, in 1946, I succeeded in getting my visa to come to the United States, and I arrived in New York in July of 46. I'm now 17 and a half. Remember, my grandmother last saw me on the outskirts of Toulouse. I was 11 years old at that time. I am now, as I said, almost 18, and my grandmother said, she lives in New York, I want you home by 8:30 every night. I don't want you to go into Central Park. It's very dangerous. Don't take up with any American girls. They all have bad intentions and designs on you. All I want to do is find an American girl that has bad designs on me. Anyhow, she told me that's out of the question. You can't do that. I couldn't wait to get out of her house. I joined the U.S. Air Force. I spent 3 years in the Air Force. I wanted to become a pilot. Remember, I wanted to become a test pilot. Well, now I'm told that you're not a citizen, so you can't become a pilot. Then I said, well, let me out of the Air Force. Do you have a conditional enlistment? What's that, sir? Well, I served 3 years. Thank goodness that I did, because those 3 years I was able to sort of catch up on my disrupted education during the war years. I came out of the Air Force, had a very varied career. I was very fortunate. I may have had a lousy teen years or childhood, but I had a wonderful career afterwards in business and in government briefly. In 1953, in September, I met a young lady at an arranged dinner party, and we took an instant dislike to one another. She was convinced that I was a Nazi. I was convinced that she was a communist. I swore I never want to see the girl again. My aunt, who had arranged the dinner party, said, you've got to walk her home. I said, I don't want to walk her home. She's impossible. I can't stand her. You must walk her home. All right. So I walked the girl home, and I hope I never see her again. We got married 4 months later. So here we are, 58 years later. I'm still married to her, thank goodness. If anyone is to be congratulated, it is she, because she's put up with me for all these years. So, and we have 2 daughters. One of our daughters delivered 2 boys, so we also have 2 grandsons. One of them at present time is a sophomore at Penn State. The other one is a sophomore in a high school. They both live in Maryland. And so that basically concludes my story. Now the question is, when I speak in a class of young students, I say, I guess, okay, so you guys are probably wondering, what does this have to do with you? How does this relate to your life? And my answer to them is this. Hatred is something that has to be taught. Some of it you pick up through osmosis. You're not born with hatred, but if your parents hate a certain type or category or group of people, you're picking it up. You're picking up the signals. And this becomes part of your thinking. And in the case of the Jews, they were a convenient scapegoat to which the Germans could blame all the things that went wrong. Why they lost the First World War, why the Weimar Republic was a disaster, why there was hyperinflation. All of this, it was the fault of the Jews. In Berlin, or in Germany, there were about 550,000 Jews out of a total German population of 60 million people. So they represented less than 1% of the total population. Most of them, some 320 or 340,000 of them, lived in Berlin. So there was a very high concentration in Berlin of lawyers, doctors, professors, and so forth. And so they were the first targets of the Nazis. But you never know what happens in this country or in your life. There may be hard economic times. Ever heard about that? There may be a lot of unemployment. There may be political problems. Parties are at each other's throat. And it's not impossible that there emerges suddenly someone, a leader, a Führer, that's what Führer means, a leader, who promises you, I'm going to put food on your table. I'm going to restore pride and honor to you. I'm going to provide you with a job. You get a snazzy uniform. You are in a privileged class. And when that happens, you may be part of the minority that's to blame for all the problems. It may be because you have red hair, or you have freckles, or you're overweight or underweight, or you're wearing the wrong clothes, you speak with an accent, whatever it is. You may be in that minority. And what I'm saying to you is, there isn't anybody in this classroom who has not at one time or another either been bullied, or was a bully, or has witnessed bullying. And the next time you see this happening, I want you to put an end to it. You have to put an end to it for two good reasons. The first one is because it is the right thing to do. It is the ethical, it is the moral thing to do. But if that doesn't suffice, I'll give you another reason. Just be very selfish. Because if you don't, you might be in that minority the next time that gets picked on. And I'd like to wrap it up by saying there was a German Protestant minister by the name of Martin Niemöller. He was one of the very few clergymen who spoke up. And he spoke up when Hitler proclaimed the Nuremberg laws. He objected. His reward, he was locked up in a concentration camp. He spent 7 years in the camps, but he was fortunate he survived. And when he came out of the camp, he put it as follows, and I'm paraphrasing here. When they came for the Jews, I kept quiet, I'm not a Jew. When they came for the communists, I'm not a communist, I kept quiet. When they came for the unionists, I don't belong to a union, it's not my problem. When they came for me, there was no one left to speak up on my behalf. And that basically is my message. I thank you all for listening to me, and I'd be glad to answer your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I stayed within my allotted time. Thank you. I hope I didn't make you dizzy pacing back and forth, but I hate standing in one place.
Wow. Before we have a question and answer period, I want to introduce a couple more people to you. We had the first day of our Holocaust Educator Workshop today, and we'll be meeting again tomorrow. And we had a couple of really special presenters with us, and one of them is Mr. Steve Feinberg, who comes to us from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And I've always introduced Steve as the walking, talking encyclopedia on the Holocaust. And the teachers know that. After listening to him today, he gave a 3-hour presentation on the whole history of the Holocaust, and it was like being in a graduate 3-credit course. Steve, everybody. Thank you so much. This was Steve's sixth workshop. He's been at every single one of them, and he just retired now from the museum. That's the bad news. But the good news is he has 2 wonderful grandchildren that live in the Twin Cities. So we're going to have him forever. He's promised. Okay. And the other person I want to introduce, and he gave me permission to tell you how old he is, but we had a concentration camp liberator with us today from Stevens Point, Wisconsin. His name is John Regnier. John is 90 years old. And to meet him, he's just an amazing man. And he and his beautiful wife, Eva May, are here with us, and they've been married 62 years. Will you please stand up? We heard from witnesses to the Holocaust, for sure. Now, we're going to have some questions, and then we'll get answers from Alex and from Peter. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and I'm going to repeat the question before they answer so that everybody can hear me. How did you find out what happened to your parents?
In 1992, the state of Florida decided to mandate the teaching of the Holocaust. Our local newspaper organized a workshop for teachers or future teachers of the Holocaust who knew very little, if anything, about it. I and 3 other survivors, I don't know